The Matilda sat in the maintenance depot like a metal beast refusing to die. Its tracks damaged, its engine silent, but its armor still defiantly intact despite the dozens of impact marks scarring its hull. Giovanni Rossetti circled the captured British tank slowly, running his practice mechanics eye over every detail, trying to understand how something this heavy, this slow, this apparently primitive in design had torn through Italian defensive positions like they were made of paper. He was 42 years old, a master mechanic who had spent 20 years working in Fiat's automotive division before being conscripted into military service when Italy entered the war. His expertise with engines and mechanical systems had saved him from infantry duty, landing him instead in a specialized unit tasked with maintaining and repairing Italian armor. Now, in the sweltering June heat of the Libyan desert, he had been given an unusual assignment: restore this captured British tank to working condition so Italian commanders could study it and hopefully learn why their own armor was proving so ineffective. Sergeant Rossetti called his assistant, a young private named Marco Benedetti who had been an apprentice machinist before the war. "I have finished the external inspection. The damage is less severe than it appears. Track repairs, some work on the running gear, possibly transmission issues. But the armor itself is completely intact. Not a single penetration." Giovanni nodded, wiping sweat from his face with a rag that was already soaked with oil and grime. "How many impact marks did you count?" 37. Most from our 47mm anti-tank guns. A few from larger caliber weapons, possibly field artillery. All of them bounced off or failed to penetrate. It is remarkable. Sergeant, I have never seen armor resist that kind of punishment. Neither have I. Giovanni approached the tank and ran his hand over one of the impact marks, feeling the depression where an Italian anti-tank round had struck and failed to punch through. The metal was scorched and dented but unbroken, testament to metallurgy that was clearly superior to anything Italy was producing. Let us get this beast opened up and see what the British have that we do not. They spent the next 3 hours removing hatches and access panels, revealing the Matilda's internal systems. The engine was a pair of AEC diesels, commercial truck engines adapted for military use. Giovanni recognized the design philosophy immediately. The British were using existing, proven components rather than designing specialized military engines from scratch. It was pragmatic and probably more reliable than the purpose-built engines that Italian tanks used, even if it seemed less elegant from an engineering standpoint. But it was when they began examining the armor itself that Giovanni felt the first stirrings of real concern. The plates were not just thick. They were beautifully manufactured, with consistent thickness, clean edges, and welds that showed professional craftsmanship. He pulled out his measuring tools and began taking precise measurements of the frontal armor, recording the data in his notebook with growing disbelief. "Marco, come look at this," he said, his voice tight with tension. "The frontal armor is 78 millimeters thick." 78. Our M13 tanks have 30 millimeters of frontal armor at best. This British tank has more than twice the protection of our heaviest production armor. Marco whistled softly. "That explains why our anti-tank guns cannot penetrate. But surely thickness alone is not the whole story. Our armor is probably better quality steel, better hardness. Better? That is what I thought too," Giovanni interrupted. "But look at this." He showed Marco a cross-section of the armor, where a failed penetration attempt had exposed the internal structure. Look at the grain structure. Look at the consistency. This is not just thick armor. This is high-quality steel, properly heat-treated, manufactured to standards that suggest serious industrial capability. They continued their examination through the afternoon, documenting everything they found. The more Giovanni learned about the Matilda, the more disturbed he became. This was not a crude, hastily built war machine. This was a carefully engineered vehicle built by people who understood metallurgy, manufacturing, and quality control at levels Italy simply did not possess. Every component they examined told the same story. Superior materials, better manufacturing, higher standards. "Sergeant," Marco said as they prepared to close up for the day, "if the British can build tanks like this, how are we supposed to fight them? Our armor cannot match this protection. Our guns cannot penetrate it. What are we supposed to do?" Giovanni had no answer. He looked at the Matilda, at its thick armor and solid construction, and felt a cold certainty settling in his gut. Italy had entered this war believing that courage and tactical skill could compensate for industrial limitations. But courage could not make thin armor thicker. Tactical skill could not make weak guns penetrate steel. The technical gap between Italian and British armor was not just significant, it was fundamental, rooted in industrial capabilities that Italy did not possess and could not quickly develop. That evening, Giovanni reported to his commanding officer, Maggiore Carlo Ferretti, in the small office the maintenance unit had established in a commandeer building near the depot. Ferretti was a regular army officer, competent but not particularly imaginative, the kind of man who followed orders without questioning the strategic assumptions behind them. "What have you learned about the British tank?" Ferretti asked without preamble. "It is superior to our armor in every meaningful way," Giovanni replied bluntly. "Thicker armor, better manufacturing quality, more reliable mechanical systems. If this Matilda is representative of British tank production, we have a serious problem." "Maggiore," Ferretti frowned. "Superior in what specific ways?" "I need concrete data for my report." Giovanni pulled out his notebook and read to the measurements and observations he had recorded. Armor thickness, steel quality, manufacturing standards, component reliability. Each piece of information added to a picture that was deeply unfavorable to Italian armor prospect. When he finished, Ferretti sat in silence for a long moment, his expression troubled. "This is concerning," Ferretti said finally. "But surely we have advantages. Speed? Maneuverability? Something that allows us to compete despite the armor disadvantage?" "The Matilda is slow," Giovanni admitted. "Top speed of perhaps 25 kilometers per hour on roads, less in desert conditions. Our M13 tanks are faster, more mobile. But Maggiore, speed does not matter if you cannot penetrate the enemy's armor and they can penetrate yours. In a direct engagement, the Matilda wins every time simply by being invulnerable to our weapons while being able to destroy us at will. Then we avoid direct engagement. We use superior tactic. We flank them. We use terrain. We employ combined arms approaches that neutralize their armor advantage." Giovanni wanted to argue, to point out that tactics had limits when the technical gap was this large. But he recognized the desperation in Ferretti's voice, the need to believe that Italian forces could somehow compensate for industrial inadequacy through cleverness and courage. It was the same desperate hope that seemed to drive much of Italy's war effort, the belief that we could overcome material reality. "Yes, Maggiore," Giovanni said quietly. "We will do our best with what we have." After leaving Ferretti's office, Giovanni walked through the depot in the cooling evening air, passing rows of damaged Italian tanks, waiting for repairs that were increasingly difficult to complete because spare parts were not arriving, because the factories back in Italy were struggling to maintain production, because the entire industrial base supporting the war effort was proving inadequate for modern armored warfare. He thought about the young men who crewed these inadequate machines, who went into battle knowing their armor could not protect them, trusting that somehow Italian technical prowess and tactical skill would carry the day. He thought about how many of them were dying because they were being asked to fight a war that industrial reality had already decided against them. And he thought about the Matilda, sitting in the depot, a physical embodiment of the technical gap that made Italian victory not just difficult but impossible. The repair work began in earnest the following morning. Giovanni assembled a team of 6 mechanics, all experienced men who had worked on Italian tanks extensively and who could be trusted to understand the significance of what they were about to learn. They gathered around the Matilda as the sun climbed over the desert horizon, bringing with it the oppressive heat that would make physical labor increasingly difficult as the day progressed. "We are going to disassemble this tank completely," Giovanni announced to his team. "Every component, every system, every piece of armor plate. I want to understand exactly how the British built this machine and why it is so much more effective than our own armor. Take measurements of everything. Document manufacturing methods. Pay attention to details that seem insignificant. Sometimes the small things reveal the most important truths." They started with the suspension system, removing the wheels and examining the springs and bogies that supported the tank's weight. What Giovanni found immediately contradicted Italian engineering assumption. The Matilda used a complex suspension design that distributed weight more evenly than the simpler systems Italian tanks employed. It was heavier, more expensive to manufacture, but demonstrably more effective at handling rough terrain and absorbing shock from movement and combat impacts. "This suspension would be impossible for us to produce in quantity," observed Corporal Antonio Ricci, a former automotive engineer who understood manufacturing constraints. "Look at the precision required for these components. The tolerances are extremely tight. This requires machine tools and quality control systems that we simply do not have in our tank factory. Giovanni nodded grimly. That is becoming a pattern. Everything about this tank requires manufacturing capabilities beyond what Italy possesses. It is not that we lack the knowledge to design such systems. We lack the industrial base to produce them at scale. They moved to the transmission next, a robust unit that showed signs of careful engineering and quality construction. Unlike Italian transmissions, which were prone to failure and required frequent maintenance, the Matilda's transmission was overbuilt, designed with reliability as a primary consideration, even if that meant additional weight and cost. Giovanni could see the design philosophy clearly. The British were building for sustained operations under harsh conditions, accepting the weight penalty in exchange for mechanical dependability. How many of our tanks break down before they even reach combat? Marco asked as they examined the transmission's internals. Half? More? And how many British tanks reached the battlefield ready to fight? Because they were built like this, with reliability prioritized over weight savings. It was a rhetorical question, but it highlighted a fundamental problem with Italian armor doctrine. Italian designers had prioritized speed and mobility, creating lighter tanks that theoretically could maneuver around heavier opponents. But that theory collapsed when the lighter tanks could not penetrate enemy armor and broke down too frequently to maintain sustained operations. The British approach, building heavier but more reliable machines, proved superior in actual combat conditions. The real revelation came when they began examining the armor plate itself in detail. Giovanni used a portable hardness testing kit to check the steel quality, taking measurements at multiple points across different armor sections. The results were consistent and disturbing. The Matilda's armor was not just thick. It was properly hardened, heat-treated to optimize strength while maintaining sufficient toughness to resist cracking under impact. The manufacturing quality was exceptional, suggesting automated processes and strict quality control. Sergeant, look at this, called Private Francesco Costa from the other side of the tank. He was examining a section of side armor that had been removed for inspection. The thickness varies by less than 1 millimeter across the entire plate. How is that possible? Our armor plates vary by 5 millimeters or more because we cannot control the rolling process precisely enough. Giovanni moved to examine the plate Costa had found. He ran his measuring tools across the surface, confirming what the private had observed. The thickness was remarkably consistent, far beyond what Italian steel mills could achieve with their current equipment and processes. This level of precision required either exceptionally skilled workers or, more likely, automated rolling mills with computerized controls that could maintain exact specifications across large production runs. This is industrial manufacturing at a level we cannot match, Giovanni said quietly. The British have automated their armor production to achieve consistency we can only dream about. Every plate that comes off their production line is identical to specification. Our plates are hand-rolled, hand-finished, each one slightly different from the last. The variation means some of our tanks have better protection than others, purely by chance of which plates they received during assembly. The team worked through the afternoon heat, taking a brief break during the worst of the midday sun before resuming their systematic disassembly. By evening, they had removed roughly half of the tank's major components, laying them out in organized rows in the maintenance shed. Giovanni walked among the parts, studying them in the better light of the indoor workspace, and with each examination his concerns deepened. The quality was evident in every component. Precision machining, careful assembly, materials that met or exceeded their design specifications. Nothing about the Matilda was crude or improvised. It was a product of serious industrial capability, built by a nation that understood modern manufacturing and had the resources to implement at scale. The contrast with Italian armor, much of which was assembled from components that barely met minimum specifications and which required extensive hand fitting during final assembly, could not have been more stark. Sergeant, may I speak frankly? Marco asked as they secured the workshop for the night. Of course, we are losing this war, are we not? Not because our soldiers lack courage or because our officers are incompetent, but because we cannot build machines that can compete with what the British and others are producing. Everything about this tank tells that story. Superior industrial base, better manufacturing, higher quality standards. We are trying to fight a modern war with an industrial economy that is not ready for it. Giovanni looked at his young assistant, seeing in his eyes the same realization that had been growing in his own mind since they began examining the Matilda. Yes, Marco, I believe we are losing, and for exactly the reasons you state. But we cannot say this openly. Such talk is defeatism, punishable under military law. So we do our jobs, we repair what we can, and we hope that somehow our leadership understands the situation and find a way to address it. But they do not understand, do they? They think this is about tactics and strategy and fighting spirit. They do not see that the fundamental problem is industrial, that we entered a war we could not win, because our factories cannot produce weapons competitive with our enemies. No, Marco, I do not think they understand. Or perhaps some of them do understand, but cannot acknowledge it because that would require admitting that Italy's entire strategic position is untenable. So they continue fighting, continue sending men to die in machines that cannot protect them, continue believing that somehow willpower and tactical skill will overcome material disadvantages. They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the disassembled components of a British tank that represented everything Italy lacked. Finally, Marco spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. What happens to us when we lose? To Italy, I mean. What happens to a nation that loses a war this badly? I do not know, Giovanni admitted. But I think we will spend decades recovering from the damage we're doing to ourselves. This war will bankrupt us economically, cost us a generation of young men, and leave us dependent on whoever wins for reconstruction assistance. It is a high price to pay for following leaders who did not understand the reality of what they were committing us to. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the depot. A German officer arrived in a staff car, accompanied by an Italian liaison officer who looked uncomfortable with whatever mission he was performing. The German was a major, his uniform crisp despite the desert environment, his bearing suggesting technical background rather than combat arms. I am Major Heinrich Schmidt, he announced in accented but fluent Italian. I am an engineer attached to the Africa Corps Technical Assessment Division. I understand you have been examining a captured British Matilda tank. My superiors wish to review your findings and compare them with our own analysis of British armor. Giovanni felt a spike of anxiety. The Germans were allies, but everyone knew the relationship was complicated, characterized by German condescension toward Italian military capabilities and Italian resentment of German arrogance. Having a German officer review their work felt less like cooperation and more like inspection, as if the Germans want to confirm their suspicions about Italian technical inadequacy. Of course, Maggiore, Giovanni replied, keeping his voice neutral. We have disassembled approximately 60% of the vehicle and documented our findings. I can show you what we have learned. Major Schmidt proved to be more knowledgeable and less condescending than Giovanni had feared. He examined the disassembled Matilda components with genuine professional interest, asking technical questions that demonstrated real understanding of armor engineering and manufacturing processes. As they walked through the maintenance shed, discussing armor thickness, steel quality, and manufacturing techniques, Giovanni found himself engaging in a kind of substantive technical conversation he had rarely experienced since entering military service. Your measurements of the armor thickness are precise, Schmidt said, reviewing Giovanni's notebook. We have examined several captured British tanks and found similar consistency in manufacturing quality. It indicates highly developed industrial processes, probably automated rolling mills with precision controls. Germany has similar capabilities, but Italy does not, correct? Giovanni hesitated, aware that admitting Italian industrial limitations to a German officer could have political implications. But Schmidt seemed genuinely interested in technical truth rather than political scoring, and the evidence was too obvious to deny. Correct. Our steel mills lack the equipment necessary to produce armor plate with this level of consistency. Our manufacturing processes are more manual, more dependent on skilled workers, less automated. It limits both quality and production volume. Schmidt nodded, unsurprised. This is the fundamental challenge of modern armored warfare. The nations that industrialized earliest and most completely have decisive advantages in manufacturing capacity and quality. Britain, America, Germany to some extent. We can produce weapon systems that smaller or less industrialized nations simply cannot match, regardless of their tactical skill or fighting spirit. You include Italy in that category? Smaller, less industrialized nations? I state an observable fact, not a judgment. Italy has significant industrial capabilities in certain areas. Fiat produces excellent automobiles. Your shipbuilding is world-class. But heavy manufacturing, particularly the specialized processes required for modern armor production, those remain underdeveloped compared to what modern warfare requires. Schmidt gestured at the Matilda's disassembled armor plates. This British tank could be produced in Italian factories with current equipment and processes? No, Giovanni admitted. We lack the rolling mills for armor this thick. We lack the heat treatment facilities to harden steel to these specifications at volume. We lack the precision manufacturing tools to create components with these tolerances. We could build one as a prototype, perhaps with enormous effort. But volume production? Impossible with our current industrial base. And yet Italy is fighting a war that requires volume production of exactly this kind of equipment. You see the problem. Giovanni saw it very clearly, had been seeing it with increasing clarity since they began examining the Matilda. The problem was not that Italian soldiers were inadequate or that Italian officers were incompetent. The problem was that Italy had entered a modern industrial war without the industrial base necessary to compete. Courage and tactical skill mattered, but they could not compensate for the ability to produce superior weapons in greater quantities. What does Germany recommend? Giovanni asked carefully. How should Italy address this industrial gap? Schmidt's expression grew somber. Germany cannot address this gap for you. We are already stretched supporting our own forces and supplementing Italian units where the need is most critical. The only real solution would be massive investment in Italian industrial infrastructure, new steel mills and manufacturing plants, and technical training programs. But that takes years to implement and requires resources that Italy does not have. So you continue fighting with what you have and hope that German success creates conditions where Italian industrial limitations become less critical. And if German success does not materialize, then we all have problems much larger than the quality of Italian tank armor. They spent the rest of the morning completing the Matilda's disassembly and analysis. Schmidt took extensive notes, photographed key components, and discussed with Giovanni the implications of what they had found. By the time they finished, both men had developed mutual respect based on shared technical expertise and honest assessment of difficult realities. Your work here has been thorough and professional, Schmidt said as he prepared to leave. I will include your findings in my report to German command. They will want to understand British manufacturing capabilities and how they compare to our own production. Thank you for your cooperation. After Schmidt departed, Giovanni gathered his team to discuss their findings and plan the reassembly process. The Matilda would be restored to working condition and then used for tactical testing, giving Italian officers first-hand experience with British armor capabilities. But Giovanni knew that no amount of tactical testing would change the fundamental problem they had identified. Italian tanks were inferior because Italian industry could not produce better ones, and that situation would not change quickly enough to affect the outcome of the North African campaign. Sergeant, Marco said as they began the reassembly process, what do we tell the crews who will have to fight against tanks like this? Do we tell them the truth? That their armor cannot protect them, and their guns cannot penetrate enemy armor? Or do we maintain the fiction that Italian technical prowess gives them a fighting chance? It was the question Giovanni had been avoiding, the moral dilemma at the heart of their work. Truth served no useful purpose if it demoralized men who still had to go into combat. But comfortable lies got people killed when they encouraged tactics that could not succeed against superior equipment. We tell them what they need to know to survive, Giovanni said finally. We explain the technical limitations of their vehicles honestly, so they can develop tactics that account for those limitations. We do not pretend that Italian armor is equal to British armor, because that lie will get them killed. But we also emphasize what advantages they do have. Speed, maneuverability in certain terrain, smaller profile, and we train them to fight smart, to avoid direct engagements where possible, to use combined arms tactics that minimize the importance of tank versus tank combat. Will it be enough? No, but it is all we can do. The reassembly took 3 days. Giovanni's team worked methodically, replacing components in reverse order of their removal, documenting everything for future reference. When they test-started the engine on the third afternoon, the twin diesels roared to life with a reliability that Italian engines rarely demonstrated. The Matilda rolled out of the maintenance shed under its own power, fully functional, ready for the tactical testing that would follow. Maggiore Ferretti observed the successful restoration with satisfaction. Excellent work, Sergeant Rossetti. This will be valuable for our tactical studies. What have you learned from examining the British tank? Giovanni chose his words carefully. We have learned that British armor manufacturing is significantly more advanced than ours. Their tanks benefit from superior industrial processes that we currently cannot replicate. This creates tactical challenges that require innovative approaches to overcome. But we can overcome them? Italian ingenuity and fighting spirit can compensate for any technical disadvantages? Giovanni looked at his commanding officer, at the desperate hope in his eyes, at the need to believe that somehow Italian forces could compete despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. He thought about all the young tank crews who would die in inadequate machines, sacrificed to maintain a fiction that industrial reality had already disproven. "We will do our best, Maggiore," he said, which was not quite a lie, but was not quite the truth either. That night, Giovanni sat alone in the maintenance shed, looking at the reassembled Matilda. In the dim light, the tank seemed almost alive, a creature from another world where resources were abundant and industry was capable of producing whatever weapons war demanded. It represented everything Italy lacked and could not quickly develop: superior materials, better manufacturing, higher standards, the accumulated advantages of industrialization that had occurred over decades and could not be replicated through willpower alone. He thought about the mechanics and engineers back in Italy, working in factories with outdated equipment, trying to produce modern weapons with inadequate resources. He thought about the soldiers who would crew inferior tanks and die in them because their nation had committed to a war it lacked the industrial capacity to fight effectively. And he thought about the leaders who had made that commitment, who had looked at Italy's limited industrial base and somehow convinced themselves that it would be sufficient for modern warfare. The anger he felt was cold and bitter, directed not at the British who had built the Matilda, or even at the Germans who condescended to Italian capabilities, but at the Italian leadership that had sent its people to fight a war they could not win. It was one thing to lose because of tactical mistakes or strategic miscalculations. It was another to lose because fundamental industrial limitations made victory impossible from the start. The tactical testing of the restored Matilda began a week later under the supervision of Colonel Andrea Borghese, a tank officer with extensive combat experience in North Africa. Giovanni was required to attend as a technical advisor, available to answer questions about the vehicle's mechanical systems and capabilities. What he witnessed over the following days confirmed everything he had learned during the disassembly and filled him with a profound sense of futility. Italian M13 tanks engaged Matilda in simulated combat scenarios, firing practice rounds at various ranges to test penetration capabilities. At 500 meters, the Italian 47mm guns could not penetrate the Matilda's frontal armor. At 300 meters, still no penetration. At 100 meters, with the Matilda stationary and presenting an ideal target, the Italian rounds bounced off or created minor surface damage, but failed to achieve meaningful penetration. The crews watched in stunned silence as their primary anti-tank weapon proved completely ineffective against British armor. "This is impossible," one tank commander muttered, loud enough for Giovanni to hear. "How are we supposed to fight something we cannot hurt?" Colonel Borghese observed the test with an expression that shifted from confidence to concern to barely controlled anger. After the fifth failed penetration attempt, he called a halt to the exercise and ordered Giovanni to join him in his command vehicle. "Sergeant, explain to me in simple terms what I just witnessed. Why can our guns not penetrate that British tank?" Giovanni had prepared for this conversation, had known it would come, but that did not make it easier. "Colonel, the Matilda has 78mm of frontal armor. Our 47mm guns firing standard ammunition can penetrate approximately 50mm of armor at close range under ideal conditions. The mathematics are straightforward. We lack sufficient penetration capability to defeat British heavy armor. Then what do? We cannot simply abandon tank warfare because the British have thicker armor. No, Colonel, but we must adapt our tactics to acknowledge reality. Direct frontal engagements against Matildas or similar British heavy tanks are futile and will result in our tanks being destroyed without inflicting damage. We must use mobility to attack from flanks or rear where armor is thinner. We must coordinate with anti-tank guns and artillery to engage British armor, while our tanks provide support and exploit opportunities. We must avoid the kind of tank versus tank combat where superior armor thickness determines the outcome. Borghese absorbed this, his jaw tight with frustration. So we must fight smarter because we cannot fight harder. We must use tactics to compensate for technical inadequacy. Yes, Colonel, that is exactly what we must do. And if the British are also smart, if they protect their flanks and coordinate their armor with infantry and artillery, what then? Giovanni had no answer that would satisfy the colonel. If both sides fought competently, technical superiority would prevail. The side with better armor, better guns, and better manufacturing would win through simple attrition, replacing losses faster than they accumulated, while the technically inferior side was ground down to nothing. It was the mathematics of industrial warfare, cold and implacable. Over the following weeks, the Matilda became a training tool, used to teach Italian tank crews the harsh realities of fighting against superior armor. Officers developed new tactical doctrines emphasizing mobility, flanking maneuvers, and combined arms coordination. Crews practiced identifying weak points on British tanks and learned to avoid direct engagements wherever possible. It was pragmatic adaptation to circumstances that could not be changed, the best they could do with resources available. Giovanni continued his maintenance work, keeping Italian tanks operational despite chronic part shortages and mechanical problems that became worse as the campaign dragged on. He watched crews go out on missions and machines he knew were inadequate, and he watched too many fail to return. Each loss reinforced what he had learned from examining the Matilda. Italy was fighting a war it lacked the industrial capacity to win. In September, Major Schmidt returned to the depot, this time accompanied by a German technical delegation examining armor developments across the North African theater. He sought out Giovanni specifically, greeting him like a colleague rather than a subordinate ally. Sergeant Rossetti, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that your analysis of the Matilda has been incorporated into German tactical guidance for fighting British armor. Your work has helped save lives by promoting realistic assessment of enemy capabilities. The bad news is that the British are now deploying even heavier tanks. We have encountered Grants and Crusaders with improved armor and armament. The technical gap is widening, not closing. And what does this mean for Italy? Schmidt's expression was grave. It means that without significant German assistance, Italian armored forces cannot compete in North Africa. Berlin is discussing options, but the reality is that German resources are also limited. We are fighting in Russia, supporting operations in Africa, preparing for potential campaigns elsewhere. We cannot carry Italy indefinitely. So what do you recommend? I recommend that Italy focus on what it can do effectively: defensive operations, infantry combat in terrain unsuitable for armor, naval and air operations where Italian capabilities are more competitive. Leave heavy armor warfare to German units that have equipment and resources to compete with British and American forces. It was pragmatic advice, but it was also an acknowledgement that Italy had been relegated to secondary status in its own war. Giovanni understood the logic, but felt the humiliation nonetheless. His nation had entered the conflict with pride and ambition, believing in its military prowess and technical capabilities. Now, less than 2 years later, it was being advised to step aside and let Germany handle the serious fighting. I will pass your recommendations to my superiors, Giovanni said quietly. After Schmidt departed, Giovanni sat in the maintenance shed and wrote a detailed report summarizing everything he had learned from examining the Matilda and observing its testing. He documented the technical specifications, the manufacturing quality, the tactical implications, and his recommendations for how Italian forces should adapt. He knew the report would likely be filed and forgotten, that it would not change strategic decisions or industrial policies. But he wrote it anyway, because bearing witness to truth felt like the only meaningful action available to him. The report concluded with a paragraph that Giovanni knew was dangerous to include, but which felt necessary. Italy entered this war believing that courage, tactical skill, and technical knowledge could compensate for limited industrial capacity. The examination of captured British armor demonstrates conclusively that this belief was mistaken. Modern warfare is fundamentally industrial. The nation with superior manufacturing capabilities, better resource access, and more advanced production techniques possesses decisive advantages that cannot be overcome through tactics alone. Italy lacks these advantages and cannot develop them quickly enough to affect the current conflict. Continued pursuit of objectives beyond our industrial capabilities will result in losses that serve no strategic purpose. This assessment is not defeatism, but realism. Understanding our limitations is the first step toward using our actual capabilities effectively. He submitted the report through official channels and waited for consequences that never came. Either his superiors agreed but could not act on the assessment, or they dismissed it as defeatist pessimism from someone who lacked broader strategic vision. Either way, nothing changed. Italian tanks continued fighting with inadequate armor and insufficient armament. Crews continued dying in machines that could not protect them, and the war ground on toward its inevitable conclusion. Giovanni remained in North Africa until the Italian surrender in 1943, maintaining tanks and training crews, and watching the slow collapse of Italian military effectiveness. He was there when British and American forces finally pushed Axis troops out of Africa, when the industrial might that the Matilda had represented overwhelmed Axis defensive positions through sheer material superiority. He was captured, spent time in a prisoner of war camp, and was eventually repatriated to Italy after the Italian government changed sides. When he returned home, he found his country devastated, its industry bombed, its economy shattered, its people exhausted by years of war fought for objectives they had never understood. Fiat rehired him, and he returned to automotive work, helping rebuild Italy's industrial base in the difficult post-war years. But he never forgot the lessons of the Matilda, never forgot what he had learned about industrial capacity and modern warfare. Years later, when Italy was rebuilding and beginning to prosper again, Giovanni was asked to lecture at a technical university about his wartime experiences. He told the students about examining the British tank, about discovering the enormous gap between Italian and British manufacturing capabilities, about understanding that his nation had fought a war it could never win. The lesson is not that courage or skill do not matter, he told them. The lesson is that they are not sufficient. Modern nations must develop industrial capabilities that match their ambitions. Italy went to war with the industrial base of a developing nation and tried to fight powers with fully mature industrial economies. The result was predictable. We lost not because Italian soldiers were cowards or Italian officers were incompetent, but because we lacked the factories and production capabilities necessary for modern warfare. One student raised his hand. So you're saying we should never have fought? Giovanni considered the question carefully. I am saying we should have understood what we were capable of before committing to conflict. War is not just about will and courage. It is about industrial production, resource management, technological development. Nations that ignore these realities do so at terrible cost. Do you think Italy has learned this lesson? Giovanni looked at the young faces in the lecture hall, the next generation that would inherit whatever Italy became in the post-war world. I hope so, because the alternative is to repeat our mistakes, to enter conflicts we cannot win, to sacrifice lives or objectives that industrial reality has already made impossible. That would be an unforgivable waste. He thought about the Matilda sometimes, about those weeks in the desert examining a machine that had revealed so much about why Italy had lost. The tank itself had probably been scrapped long ago, recycled into something useful for the post-war world. But what it had represented remained relevant. The importance of industrial capability. The reality that modern warfare required manufacturing sophistication that could not be improvised or overcome through willpower alone. The hard truth that some wars were lost before they began, decided by productive capacity rather than battlefield courage. It was a lesson Giovanni had learned while covered in oil and sweat, disassembling a captured British tank in the Libyan desert. And it was a lesson he believed Italy needed to remember, so that future generations would not repeat the mistakes that had cost so many lives achieving so little. The North African campaign demonstrated repeatedly that industrial capacity determined outcomes in modern warfare more than tactical skill or fighting spirit. The story of Giovanni Rossetti and the captured Matilda tank illustrates how technical personnel on all sides came to understand this reality, often long before the political and military leadership accepted it. If you want to explore more stories of how industrial and technical factors shaped World War II outcomes, subscribe to join us as we examine the economic and manufacturing dimensions of history's greatest conflict.